Every empire believes it is different, more advanced, more rational, and somehow immune to the forces that destroyed those before it. Rome believed its institutions were eternal, protected by tradition, law, and the weight of history itself. Britain believed its global system of trade and finance could never be replaced or meaningfully challenged. The Soviet Union believed ideology alone could override economic reality and human behavior indefinitely. Today, the United States believes the same assumption applies to its own system and its global position. But history does not respond to belief, confidence, or moral intention. It responds only to structure, incentives, and the predictable limits of human behavior. Across centuries, empires do not collapse randomly, suddenly, or by accident. They follow a repeatable sequence, a historical algorithm that never changes.
Every large empire passes through the same 5 structural stages, regardless of culture, ideology, or historical era. These stages are not political opinions, moral failures, or isolated leadership mistakes. They are systemic transitions caused by scale, complexity, and predictable human behavior under pressure. Stage 1 is expansion, when cohesion is strong and collective trust fuels rapid growth. Stage 2 is peak complexity, where institutions become efficient, powerful, but increasingly fragile. Stage 3 is financialization, when debt, leverage, and abstraction replace real economic production. Stage 4 is psychological fragmentation, where trust erodes and shared reality begins to collapse. Stage 5 is systemic reset, through collapse, replacement, or forced structural transformation. Most people believe empires fall at the final stage, but the real damage begins much earlier. Rome did not collapse because of invasion, chaos, or sudden external pressure from outside forces. The empire entered structural decline long before enemies ever reached its distant borders. Territorial expansion slowed dramatically, while military, bureaucratic, and administrative costs kept rising. To preserve short-term stability, Rome chose currency manipulation instead of meaningful structural reform. Silver coins were gradually diluted, their real value reduced slowly and almost invisibly over time. Prices increased across the empire, trust eroded, and economic coordination became increasingly unstable. Soldiers demanded higher wages, while farmers resisted selling goods at fixed official prices. Institutions continued to operate, but confidence in the system was quietly disappearing everywhere. By the time collapse became visible, Rome had already failed psychologically, long before it failed politically. The most dangerous phase of Rome's collapse began only after its economic foundations had already been deeply weakened. Romans gradually stopped trusting central authority, imperial institutions, and the long-term promises made by the state. Loyalty shifted away from Rome itself and toward local leaders, regions, families, and immediate personal survival. The idea of a shared imperial future slowly disappeared from the collective imagination of Roman society. Laws, courts, and administrations still existed, but they no longer carried meaning, credibility, or real legitimacy. Complex systems remained in place, yet the cohesion that once connected them quietly dissolved over time. Collapse did not arrive as a single dramatic moment or a sudden, violent historical catastrophe. Instead, it unfolded as a long erosion of belief, confidence, and shared identity across multiple generations. By the end, Rome still existed as a structure of power, but no longer as a unified civilization. The British Empire ruled less through direct conquest than through trade, finance, and unrivaled naval dominance. At its peak, it controlled global flows of goods, capital, shipping routes, and strategic resources across continents. However, the First World War marked a profound structural rupture in the imperial economic system. The cost of maintaining global influence,
began to exceed Britain's real productive and industrial capacity. Debt increasingly replaced expansion as the primary mechanism for sustaining power and stability. Britain entered Stage 3 quietly, legally, and without any dramatic moment of visible collapse. Industrial output weakened over time, while finance, administration, and bureaucracy expanded rapidly. London transformed into a global financial center rather than a manufacturing or industrial engine. The empire still appeared vast and powerful, but beneath the surface, it had become structurally fragile.
Stage 4 began when confidence in the British imperial system slowly but decisively started to erode across society. Colonies increasingly questioned British legitimacy, authority, and the promise of stable, long-term leadership. The narrative of inevitability that once sustained the empire no longer convinced populations, elites, or administrators. Power still existed through institutions, treaties, legal frameworks, and military presence, but belief quietly dissolved. Britain did not collapse violently, suddenly, or through revolution, invasion, or internal civil war. Instead, it dissolved through negotiations, withdrawals, and carefully managed administrative and political decisions. The empire continued to exist on paper far longer than it functioned meaningfully in lived reality. Systems still operated efficiently, but without a shared imperial purpose, direction, or collective confidence. Decline became procedural, bureaucratic, and orderly rather than dramatic, explosive, or openly catastrophic. The collapse of the Soviet Union followed the same structural pattern observed in earlier historical empires. Economic stagnation appeared first, quietly signaling the transition into Stage 3 of systemic decline. Central planning gradually stopped responding to real conditions, shortages, inefficiencies, and local realities. Instead of adapting its structure, the system intensified ideology to preserve authority and internal control. Official narratives increasingly replaced observable reality and measurable economic outcomes across society. Statistics became distorted or openly fictional, and trust inside institutions began to erode rapidly. Citizens slowly stopped believing that the future promised by the state was achievable or even real. Without belief, coordination across society weakened, and systemic resilience quietly disappeared. Long before its formal end, the Soviet system had already hollowed itself out from within. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of a decisive war, invasion, or sudden external shock from abroad. Instead, it gradually lost internal coherence, credibility, and trust across every level of the system. Institutions continued to function mechanically, following procedures without conviction, confidence, or belief. Rules were enforced, plans were issued, and reports were filed. But meaning had already disappeared. Citizens no longer felt connected to the system or invested in its long-term future outcomes. When belief fades, coordination weakens, and large, complex systems cannot sustain themselves for long. From that moment, collapse becomes inevitable and often accelerates far faster than expected. The final moment appears sudden only to those who ignore the long sequence of earlier warning signs. By the end, the algorithm had already completed its work, long before the state formally ceased to exist. The United States completed Stage 3 of the imperial cycle several years before it was publicly acknowledged. Debt gradually replaced production, while financial markets became increasingly detached from real economic output. Asset inflation masked deep structural stagnation affecting wages, productivity, and long-term economic growth. For a time, rising markets created the illusion of stability, prosperity, and continued systemic strength. Today, however, the system has clearly entered Stage 4 of the collapse pattern. This stage is psychological and social in nature, not merely financial or economic.
Trust in institutions erodes across political, economic, cultural, and informational domains simultaneously. Shared reality fragments into competing narratives that no longer converge or reconcile with one another. At this stage, instability becomes a permanent condition, rather than a temporary or cyclical crisis.
Empires do not fall because they are uniquely evil, corrupt, or morally inferior to those that came before them. They fall because complexity eventually grows faster than cohesion inside the system that sustains them. Institutions expand, rules multiply, and structures become harder to understand, manage, and trust over time. As systems grow larger, confidence slowly erodes between people, power, and shared national narratives. Rome believed its empire was eternal, protected by history, law, and the weight of tradition itself. Britain believed its global system was indispensable to world order, trade, and long-term stability. The Soviet Union believed collapse was structurally impossible within its ideological framework. All three assumptions proved to be catastrophically wrong once the algorithm reached its final stage. The United States is not unique in this cycle, and the algorithm is already running.